Welcome to Sleevore. This channel is a quiet place for bedtime stories, where ancient stories are told slowly, with calm voices and gentle music to help you rest and fall asleep. Tonight's story comes from the Bible. It is inspired by the life of David before he became a king, before his name was known, when his days were spent in the fields, watching sheep under the open sky. This is not a sermon, and it is not a lesson. It is a story told with faith and reflection, drawn from Scripture and shared gently for the quiet hours of the night. If you find comfort in these stories, you are welcome to like the video and subscribe to Sleevore so you can return to stories like this again. Now allow your thoughts to slow. Let the day fade into the background and listen as we return to a time before David was a king. Before David was known by anyone beyond his family, he lived a life that passed quietly through the days. He was the youngest son of Jesse, born into a household where strength was measured by age, and worth was often seen in what could be proven. His brothers were taller, older, and already shaped by expectations. David, by contrast, was given the fields. Each morning began the same way. The light rose slowly over the hills near Bethlehem, and David gathered the sheep, guiding them away from the village and toward open ground. The work was steady and unremarkable. There were no witnesses, no rewards, and no recognition. Yet it was here that David learned how to remain attentive, even when nothing seemed to happen. The land was not gentle. Stones lay hidden beneath dry grass, and thorns caught easily on cloth and skin. The sheep moved without urgency, following familiar paths, stopping often to graze. David walked among them with patience, listening to the sounds of the earth beneath his feet. He knew which animals wandered and which stayed close. He learned their habits, their fears, and their needs. This knowledge came not from instruction, but from time. When the sun climbed higher, the air grew warm and still. Shadows shortened, and the hills seemed to hold their breath. David rested when he could, sitting on the ground with his staff nearby, eyes always alert. Even in quiet hours, danger was never far. A sudden movement in the brush, an unfamiliar sound carried by the wind, could mean trouble. It was during these long stretches of watchfulness that David began to speak to God. There was no formality to his prayers. He did not speak loudly or use words meant to impress. He spoke as one speaks when no one else is listening. Sometimes he sang. Sometimes he remained silent. Sometimes he simply watched the sky and felt the weight of the day settle around him. As evening approached, the light softened and the fields changed. Colors deepened and the air cooled. The sheep gathered closer together, sensing the coming night. David guided them toward places he knew would be safer after dark. He had learned through experience which valleys invited danger and which offered shelter. Night brought its own challenges. The darkness was not complete, but it was deep enough to hide movement. The stars appeared slowly, scattered across the sky in patterns David came to recognize. He watched them often, not because he understood their meaning, but because they reminded him that the world was larger than the fields he guarded. Scripture tells us that David protected his flock from lions and bears. These were not rare dangers, but real threats that moved quietly through the hills. When they came, there was no one to call for help. David stood alone, armed only with what he carried and what he trusted. In those moments, fear did not disappear, but it did not rule him. He acted because he had to, and because the sheep depended on him. Each encounter left its mark, not always visible, but lasting. David learned that strength did not come only from size or force, but from resolve. He learned that courage could exist without recognition, and slowly, without realizing it, his heart was being shaped. Back in Bethlehem, life continued without him. His brothers trained, spoke of battles, and prepared for futures that seemed clearer than his own. David returned home when needed, but the fields remained his primary place. It was there that his days unfolded, one after another, without interruption. Then one day, everything shifted quietly. The prophet Samuel arrived in Bethlehem, sent by God to anoint a new king for Israel. The people of the town were uncertain and cautious. Samuel's presence carried weight, and his purpose was not immediately known. Jesse was called, and his sons were presented one by one. David was not among them. He remained in the fields, tending the sheep as he always had. There was no message sent to retrieve him, no expectation that he should be present. To those gathered, the choice seemed obvious. Strength, stature, and experience stood before Samuel, waiting to be seen. Yet one by one, Samuel was told that none of them were the one God had chosen. Only then did Samuel ask if all of Jesse's sons were present. Jesse hesitated before answering. He mentioned the youngest, almost as an afterthought, still tending the sheep. At Samuel's insistence, David was sent for. When David arrived, he carried the marks of his work. Dust clung to his clothing, his hands were rough, his face was shaped by sun and wind. He did not look like a king, and he did not expect to be treated as one. But God saw what others had overlooked. Samuel anointed David with oil in the presence of his brothers. The act was simple, almost quiet. There were no explanations given, no declarations made. The oil touched David's head, and with it came a change that could not yet be seen. The Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. And then, just as quietly, Samuel departed. There was no celebration, no immediate transformation. David did not receive instructions or authority. He did not leave with Samuel. Instead, life returned to what it had been. David went back to the fields. This moment carries a truth that unfolds slowly. God's calling does not always alter our circumstances right away. Sometimes it deepens them. David had been chosen, but his days remained the same. He still woke early. He still walked the hills. He still guarded sheep through the night. Yet something within him had changed. Time passed, and the land grew restless. Tension rose as the Philistines gathered their forces. Saul, the current king, was troubled, and the Spirit of the Lord had departed from him. Music was brought to soothe his distress, and David, known for his skill with the harp, was called into service. David moved between worlds. One moment he stood in the presence of the king, playing softly to ease his troubled spirit. The next, he returned to the fields, resuming the quiet rhythm of his former life. He wore no armor, held no rank, and claimed no position. Yet he watched and listened. War approached, and Israel's army prepared to face the Philistines. David's brothers went to the battlefield, while David was sent with provisions, tasked with carrying food and messages. He obeyed, rising early and leaving the sheep in capable care before setting out. When David arrived at the camp, he heard shouting. Not the sound of battle, but of challenge. Goliath, the Philistine champion, stood before Israel, calling out day after day. His voice carried across the valley, filled with confidence and contempt. He mocked Israel and defied the armies of the living God. The soldiers listened, and fear took hold. No one answered the challenge. Day after day, the same words were spoken, and no response came. David listened differently. He did not measure Goliath by height or armor. He heard the words spoken against God, and something within him stirred. He asked questions, not out of pride, but out of confusion. Why was this allowed to continue? Why did no one respond? Those around him dismissed his concerns. His brothers grew angry, accusing him of arrogance and distraction. They reminded him of his place, of his youth, of his lack of experience. But David remembered the fields. He remembered the nights when danger approached and no one else was there. He remembered the moments when fear could have ruled him but did not. He remembered the God who had been present then, unseen but faithful. Word reached Saul, and David was brought before the king. Saul looked at him and saw what others saw. A boy, untested and unarmed. He doubted David's ability, but David spoke plainly. He did not boast. He recounted what had already happened. The lion, the bear, the deliverance that had come not through strength alone, but through trust. Saul offered his armor, heavy and unfamiliar. David tried it on, then set it aside. It was not what he knew. It was not what had carried him through the nights. Instead, David chose what had always been with him, a sling. Stones from the stream, tools shaped by use, not ceremony. As David stepped forward, the valley fell silent. Goliath moved to meet him, confident in his size and power. He saw David and despised him. Words were exchanged, sharp and final. David spoke not of himself, but of God. He ran toward the battle, not away from it. The stone flew, guided by a hand steady from years of practice. It struck its mark, and the giant fell. The battle ended quickly after that. Fear gave way to movement, and Israel pressed forward. Victory followed. But long before that moment, before the valley, before the stone, David's path had already been set. What followed would bring songs, jealousy, and trials. David's life would grow more complex, more difficult, and more visible. Yet at its foundation remained the same truth. Before David was a king, he was faithful. He was faithful in the fields, faithful in the dark, faithful when no one was watching. And it was there, long before the crown, that his story truly began. After the valley fell quiet and the dust settled, David did not step into a new life all at once. Victory did not carry him immediately into peace. Instead, it drew him closer to the center of attention, where silence was harder to find and faith would be tested in different ways. David was brought into Saul's household more often after that day. His name began to circulate among the people, spoken with admiration and surprise. Songs were sung, not with careful restraint, but with joy that carried further than intended. They praised Saul for his thousands, and David for his tens of thousands. Words like these, once released, could not be taken back. At first, David remained unaware of the shift taking place around him. He continued to serve as he always had, playing music for the king, standing where he was told to stand, speaking only when spoken to. His manner did not change, though his presence now carried weight. Saul noticed what had once been relief when David played the harp slowly turned into unease. The calm that settled over Saul no longer felt like peace, but like dependence. The young shepherd had entered his life at a moment of weakness, and now his shadow seemed to grow longer with each passing day. David sensed the change without fully understanding it. He noticed Saul's eyes linger longer than before, searching rather than resting. He felt the tension in the room when the music ended, the air heavy with thoughts unspoken. Still, David did not withdraw. He remained respectful, steady, and present. This, too, was a kind of faith. David was given responsibilities within the army. He went out with the soldiers and returned safely again and again. Scripture tells us that the Lord was with him and that his success became evident to all who watched. But success did not protect him, it exposed him. Saul's fear deepened, and with it came suspicion. The king began to see David not as a servant, but as a threat. What Saul feared most was not David's strength, but God's favor upon him. David did not respond with ambition or challenge. He did not seek to advance himself. When Saul offered him his daughter in marriage, David hesitated, questioning his worthiness. He spoke of his low position, his lack of status, his place as the youngest son of a modest household. Yet even humility can be misunderstood. Saul's intentions grew darker. Opportunities meant to elevate David became traps meant to destroy him. David was sent into battle again and again, placed where danger was certain. Each time he returned unharmed. Each return added to Saul's fear. Through it all, David continued to act with restraint. He did not rebel. He did not speak against the king. He trusted that the God who had shaped him in the fields would not abandon him now. Jonathan, Saul's son, saw David clearly. A bond formed between them, not out of strategy, but out of shared understanding. Jonathan recognized God's hand upon David and loved him as himself. Where Saul saw threat, Jonathan saw purpose. This friendship became a refuge for David. In Jonathan's presence, he was not a rival or a weapon. He was simply himself. Together they spoke honestly, quietly, aware that the ground beneath them was shifting. As Saul's hostility grew more visible, David's life became increasingly uncertain. One moment he was welcomed, the next pursued. A spear thrown in anger missed its mark, but its message was unmistakable. David's place in the palace was no longer safe. Jonathan warned him. Plans were made in secret. Signals were agreed upon. David hid, waiting for confirmation of what his heart already knew. When Jonathan returned with tears in his eyes, David understood that the path ahead would not lead through comfort. David fled. He left behind familiarity and entered a season of wandering. The fields of his youth had been quiet and predictable. The wilderness he now entered was neither. Caves became shelter. Darkness returned, but in a different form. This darkness carried uncertainty rather than routine. Yet David was not alone. Others began to gather around him. Men burdened by debt, discontent, or distress found their way to David. He did not choose them for strength or reputation. They came because they recognized something in him, a steadiness that had been formed long before leadership was demanded of him. David became a leader without a title. He provided direction without authority granted by men. He guided, protected, and restrained those who followed him. The same care he once gave to sheep now extended to people. Saul pursued David relentlessly. The king's fear had hardened into obsession. He mobilized forces, searched valleys, and surrounded caves. David moved constantly, never settling long enough to feel secure. In one such cave, an opportunity arose that would toggle the future of Israel. Saul entered the cave alone, unaware that David and his men were hidden deeper inside. The moment was clear. The king who sought David's life stood defenseless. David's men urged him forward, whispering that this was God's provision, the moment when the promise could be claimed. David approached silently. His hand was steady as he cut a corner of Saul's robe. He did not strike. He did not raise his weapon. He stepped back, heart pounding. After Saul left the cave, David called out to him. He showed the piece of fabric as proof. His voice carried respect, not accusation. He spoke of loyalty, of innocence, of trust in God's judgment rather than his own. Saul wept. For a moment, clarity returned. Saul acknowledged David's righteousness and his own failure. He spoke of the kingdom that would one day belong to David and asked for mercy for his descendants. David listened. Yet he did not return to the palace. He did not assume safety where patterns had already been established. Wisdom guided his steps as much as faith. He continued to move, to wait, to endure. This season of waiting was long. David wrote songs during this time, words shaped by fear and hope intertwined. Psalms emerged from caves and open ground, from moments of desperation and gratitude. They were not composed for performance, but for survival. God became not only a distant presence, but a refuge, a stronghold, a shelter in the storm. Eventually, Samuel died. The prophet who had anointed David quietly passed from the world. The man who had confirmed God's choice was gone, and David remained without a crown, without security, and without certainty of timing. Still, David waited. Saul's pursuit continued until the day it ended abruptly. In battle against the Philistines, Saul and his sons fell. Jonathan was among them. The news reached David not as triumph, but as grief. David mourned. As this story comes to a close, allow the quiet to remain with you. David's journey reminds us that faith is often formed slowly in places that seem ordinary and in seasons that feel unseen. If this story brought you a sense of calm, you are welcome to like the video and subscribe to Sleevore, where more gentle bedtime stories are shared for quiet nights like this. Now, let your thoughts soften. Let the day fade away, and may you rest peacefully, knowing that you are seen, even in the quiet. Good night.